So back when many of the Democratic primaries hadn't yet been fully pushed off until we had a better idea of what was going to happen with the pandemic, we were faced with Wisconsin and the possibility that if in-person voting continued, that some people could be exposed to coronavirus, could become infected, and indeed die. And in the run-up to it, you had people lining up on trying to shut it down, some believing that it should continue. At the time, Democratic Governor Tony Evers called on the GOP-controlled state legislature to consider postponing the election until May 26th, with the majority of in-person voting suspended and voters obtaining absentee ballots by May 19th. Republican lawmakers convened, but refused to consider the proposal, and the state Supreme Court sided with the GOP. The U.S. Supreme Court also overturned a lower court ruling to extend the absentee ballot deadline in what journalist Mark Joseph Stern called, quote, one of the most brazen acts of voter suppression in modern times, because we can expect that many people would not have even gotten their absentee ballot by the time that this newly required deadline would have been put in effect. And the entire thing is one of the most disgusting moments in modern voter suppression that I've seen, because all of this concern about the in-person voting, about the absentee ballots, was entirely the Republican Party interfering with an election of the Democratic Party. I understand not every one of the elections was just Democrats, but the vast majority were. The vast majority of the voters were going to be Democrats. And it is absurd that the state Republican Party and the Republican-dominated Supreme Court nationally was able to get involved and to force this, now we're finding out, potentially deadly turn of events.
Well, it was also stupid for the Republicans because it wound up, while we all thought that it was the Democratic race, and we all knew that more Democrats would come out to vote in a Democratic primary, even though by then it had been fairly well established how it was going to turn out. This was about a Supreme Court seat there, and that Supreme Court seat, the Republicans wanted to hold on to an appointment there because they wanted to further suppress the vote for the general election, which is the one they're thinking about more than any of them. They lost that race, and they lost it badly, so it came back to bite them in another way. But now you're going to discuss, too, why it was the reason why we all knew that it was a bad idea.
Yeah. And we knew that there was a likelihood that if you had people lining up for long periods of time, and in a time when 99% of the polling places were shut down, and so people had to crowd at the ones that were still open, we knew that people would be exposed to it. And what do you know? Evidence is now coming in showing that some were. At least 19 people in Wisconsin who said they voted in person or worked the polls for the state's April 7th primary election have tested positive for the coronavirus, according to the state health department. The vast majority of the data isn't yet in. Those numbers are almost certainly going to rise. So this is what I was worried about. And those people, many of them refused to show up to work the polls, totally understandably so. Nobody wants to interact with hundreds or thousands of individuals. And so in the end, the National Guard had to be brought in to do some of the manning of that. And perhaps some of them ended up getting sick. Neither the voters nor the National Guard, nobody should have been put in this position. And that's what was being said at the time. It gives me no pleasure whatsoever to talk about this now, to confirm that what we were worried about is turning out to be true.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that 19 people wouldn't have gotten coronavirus anyway. We don't know how much that changed. But what we do know is that people were saying, don't do this. Doctors were saying, don't do this. The public was saying, don't do this. And they went ahead and did it. And so there has to have been a bad turnout. I'm sorry for the turnout pun, but there has to have been a bad result here because of the fact that they went ahead and did it. And the Republicans were so politically tone deaf, which they're not generally, to have pushed this forward in the way that they did, because that race, that Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, was everything on that election day. And they lost it when they thought that they were going to win it, and they could control the court, and they could control a planned voter purge that was going to happen. All of that is over. All of that worked out well for the Democrats, not the Republicans. And on top of that, you have people who got coronavirus because of the fact that they kept the polls open.
Yeah, and look, them going forward with it at the time, that seems like, the worst outcome of this story. But we have one wrinkle to make it even worse. Wisconsin still plans to go forward with a special election for its 7th congressional district on May 12th. But they say, no, this is going to be different. This is more rural, so the in-person voting is going to have less crowds and stuff like that. Okay, good. It won't be as big of a disaster. Still a disaster. And one
right.
that... Or is
affecting rural people instead of city people. And yes, there will be polling stations that need to accommodate fewer people. But with what we know now, how can it not be lesson learned? It's just astonishing.
Yeah, God, goddamn disaster. And we know what needs to be done for future elections, both in terms of these continuing primaries, but also for the national election. It is amazing that the Republican Party is so brazen and has been so successful in their effort to hamper any effort to get our elections ready for the likelihood that coronavirus is still going to be a significant concern come November.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.